We've discussed quite a few times recently on the channel whether being a pro cyclist these days is actually easier than it was in the past. And one thing that gets brought up time and time again is that modern training methods just aren't quite as epic as they used to be. Back in the days of Fausto Coppi, Eddie Merckx and Bernardino, riders would head out on literally hundreds of kilometre training rides day after day. And on these epic rides, they would include some frankly insane and brutal training methods as well. So I felt oddly inspired to give it a go myself. If you're going to try an epic old school training session, you might as well attempt one from one of the greatest cyclists of all time, Fausto Coppi. If you're not familiar with Fausto Coppi, here's a very brief history lesson. His nickname was Il Campionissimo, the champion of champions. And if that doesn't already tell you enough, check out his palmarès. 5-time Giro d'Italia winner, 2-time Tour de France winner, 5-time Il Lombardia winner, 3-time Milan San Remo winner, World Road Race champion and a Paris-Roubaix win in there as well, along with many, many others. And if that doesn't sound astounding, factor in that when Coppi should have been hitting the best form of his career, the Second World War broke out, effectively robbing him and everyone else of his 6 greatest years of his career. The thing that defined Coppi though was how he would win the races. Another pro of the time, Raffaele Geminiani, once famously claimed that you didn't need a stopwatch to measure the gap to second place. You could use the clock on a church tower. Such were his margins of victory. And once Coppi had attacked, the rest of the race would rarely see him again. But how did he get so strong? We think we may have found the answer in one of his favoured training sessions. It's not a complicated session, but its brutality lies very much within its simplicity. Coppi would ride solo for 150 kilometres before meeting up with a group of strong amateurs and asking them to relentlessly attack him for a further 100 kilometres. It sounds awful, doesn't it? And that's where I become a guinea pig again, because I get to try it out. Fausto Coppi was from the Piedmont area of Italy, where you had a good mixture of flat roads on the plains to the north, or a slightly hillier ride if you headed south towards the coast. With this in mind, I've tried to replicate something similar using the app Komoot. Now, you may have heard one of Fausto Coppi's most famous training quotes, ride your bike, ride your bike, ride your bike. And it turns out he wasn't referring to riding mile on end. He was actually referring to the specificity of his training. Basically, if you want to get good at doing one thing, do that one thing a lot. And if you think about how a bike race often pans out, steady at the start before a gradual ramp up in intensity, lots of attacking and a lack of control, Fausto Coppi's epic training session starts to make quite a bit of sense. As for the length of these training rides, well, it's important to remember that races back then were quite a bit longer than they are now. Take, for example, the 1947 Giro d'Italia that Fausto Coppi won. 9 of those stages were over 200 kilometres in length, and 3 of those were over 260 kilometres. So a pro back then did need to focus on their long rides. And that's quite different to how pros train today. These days, it is actually rare for a pro to train much more than 5 hours day after day after day. Instead, with the advancements in training knowledge, structured intervals are the focus, and it's rare for a pro to do much more than 3 to 4 hours on a daily basis.
So I'm coming to the end of the first part of my ride now, which I've got to be honest, is really weird. 150 kilometres would be a really long ride for me these days, so the idea of adding another 100 kilometres is a bit daunting. And they're going to attack me for the entire ride.
We put a call out to a few local riders for help for the next part of this video, but because it's the middle of the week and we're in the middle of nowhere, we've ended up with a pro, an ex-pro, and what looks like an aerodynamic specialist. Look at his bars if you don't know what I mean. They've agreed quite happily to attack me for the next 100 kilometres. This part of the ride, I think, is deceptively clever because depending on what sort of session I want to have, I can choose to respond to the attacks straight away, giving me a sprint workout, or I can drag out the efforts for 10 to 20 minutes and slowly reel them all back in, creating more of a threshold type workout. Let's see how it goes. on to my next point. This isn't just a physical workout, it's also a mental workout as well. And more specifically, it's a tactical workout. And the reason for this is I need to constantly make the calculation as to what sort of rider is attacking me. If they're a time trialist, I cannot afford to let them get a gap. I have to sprint and get straight on top of it and shut down their effort. Otherwise, I'm going to be chasing for a long, long time. And conversely, if there is a sprinter attacking, I don't need to get on it straight away. I can reel them back in with my superior time trial strength myself. And that makes it very race specific, constantly analysing the situation that's changing on the road. If you compare that to modern training methods, pros these days have to think about something completely different. Power numbers and perhaps uploading a GPX route to their head unit. And I think it's that form of concentration that makes Fausto Coppi's training ride so demanding. For example, speak to any pro after a really tough, aggressive race, and they'll tell you it wasn't just physically fatiguing, but also mentally fatiguing. Fausto Coppi replicated that perfectly with this epic training session. So was training really harder in the past? Well, even if you can't tell, after a couple of cups of coffee, I'm still completely exhausted. I had to go super deep, especially in the second half of that ride. But was the ride actually any harder than a modern training session? Well, looking at my power numbers, the answer is simply no. At no point did I exceed any of the numbers I'd see on a normal training session. But that's not really a surprise, considering I did have to ride for nearly twice the duration. But then again, riding 250 kilometers on its own is a big effort and takes some serious consideration. And that's before you factor in all those attacks I had to follow in the second half. In the end, it's horses for courses. If, as a modern cyclist, I trained for races back in the 50s, there's no way I would have been competitive. I simply wouldn't have had the endurance to keep up. And likewise, if a 1950s rider was to train for modern races, they'd barely be warmed up by the time the race had finished and wouldn't have the intensity in their legs to be competitive. If you enjoyed this video, give it a big thumbs up. Before you go though, check out Ollie's Iceland Epic just down there.